The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange as dry leaves crunched beneath Sloane Mercer's boots. She took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp autumn air, savoring the last moments of peace in the park before heading home. By her side, Axel, her German shepherd, walked with silent vigilance. His sharp gaze scanned the surroundings, his posture rigid. This was no ordinary dog. There was something in his eyes, something that told a story of battles fought and won, of commands obeyed without hesitation. Sloane knew his past. Axel had once been a military working dog, trained for combat and high-risk rescue missions. But after a tragic incident, he had been retired and put up for adoption. From the moment she brought him home, he had never left her side. He was more than a pet. He was a guardian. The park was nearly empty now, the trees casting long shadows as darkness crept in. A strange silence filled the air, an unnatural stillness that made the hair on the back of Sloane's neck rise. Then she heard it, the low, distant rumble of engines. Within seconds, the sound grew louder, and when she turned, she saw them. 3 men on motorcycles speeding toward her, their headlights cutting through the dimming light. The riders slowed as they reached her, their bikes growling like caged beasts. The leader, a broad-shouldered man clad in a black leather jacket, was the first to remove his helmet. His smirk was the kind that made her stomach tighten. Behind him, the other 2 chuckled, their eyes scanning her like prey. "Late for a walk all alone, sweetheart?" the leader said, stepping closer. Sloane's breath hitched. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs felt cemented to the ground. Maybe she needs some company. One of the others sneered. Her heart pounded violently in her chest, but she wasn't alone. Axel, who had remained silent up until now, took a slow, deliberate step forward. His body stiffened, his hackles bristled, and a deep, menacing growl rumbled in his throat. The men laughed. "What's this? You think your little pup is going to protect you?" The leader mocked, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his voice as he met Axel's piercing gaze. What they didn't know was that they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Colt Maddox stepped forward, his heavy boots grinding against the loose gravel. The smirk on his face deepened as he sized up Sloane, his piercing blue eyes gleaming with amusement. He had seen fear in people's eyes before. He knew how it looked, how it smelled. And tonight, he could practically taste it in the air. "You don't have to be scared, sweetheart," he said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "We just want to talk." Behind him, Jace Holloway and Ryder Nash exchanged glances, their expressions filled with the same dark amusement. They had played this game before too many times to count. Isolate, intimidate, take control. It always worked. No one ever fought back. No one ever had the nerve. Sloane was just another girl who had made the mistake of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But what none of them realized, what they were too arrogant to even consider, was that she wasn't alone. Axel stood at her side, motionless, but his presence was anything but passive. His ears were erect, his body tense, his breathing measured. He was watching them, analyzing them, waiting to strike. Colt and his gang thought he was just a dog, a well-trained pet maybe, but still just an animal, nothing that a good kick or a few well-placed punches couldn't handle. Colt had fought bigger men before, had taken down threats twice his size. What was one dog? "I wouldn't do that." Sloane finally spoke, her voice lower than she intended. She wanted it to sound firm, steady, but the truth was her heart was pounding so hard she could hear in her ears. She tightened her grip on Axel's leash, though deep down, she knew it was useless. If he decided to move, nothing would stop him. "Walk away now," Colt chuckled, shaking his head. "You got some fire, I'll give you that." His hand twitched it aside, fingers curling as he took another step closer. "But you don't get it, do you? There's no walking away. This is happening whether you like it or not." Then he reached for her. In an instant, everything changed. Axel exploded forward with terrifying speed. The leash snapped from Sloane's hand like it was nothing. His body became a blur of muscle and instinct, launching itself toward Colt with precise, lethal intent. There was no hesitation, no warning, just the raw, unstoppable force of a creature trained for war. Colt barely had time to react before Axel's teeth sank into his forearm, the impact sending him stumbling backward with a startled, agonized yell. Jace and Ryder froze. They had expected a struggle, maybe even some resistance, but not this. Not a fully trained military dog, turning their leader into prey. They watched in shock as Colt collapsed on the ground. Axel still latched onto him, growling like a demon unleashed. Blood dripped onto the gravel. The air filled with Colt's curses, his voice laced with pain and panic. "Get this thing off me," he howled, his bravado gone in an instant. But Axel wasn't letting go. Colt Maddox crashed onto the dirt with a force that sent shockwaves through his body. The searing pain in his arm eclipsed everything else. Axel's jaws were locked, the pressure increasing with terrifying precision. Colt had been in fights before. Bar brawls, street scuffles, run-ins with other bikers. But nothing had ever felt like this. This wasn't a dog bite. It was a calculated tactical assault. And Colt was a target. The agony ripping through his muscles was unbearable. His skin was punctured by razor-sharp teeth that refused to let go. He thrashed violently, trying to dislodge Axel, but the war dog only dug in deeper, a guttural growl vibrating through his massive chest. "Shoot it! Shoot the damn thing!" Colt's voice, once laced with cocky arrogance, now cracked with desperation. His breaths were ragged, his movements frantic. He wasn't used to losing control. He wasn't used to being hunted. Jace Holloway and Ryder Nash stood just a few feet away, frozen in place. Their usual bravado evaporated as they watched the scene unfold. Colt had always been the leader, the strongest among them. If he couldn't overpower this dog, what chance did they have? Axel wasn't attacking like some wild mutt defending its owner. He was trained for war. The discipline in his movements, the lethal precision of his bite, the way his weight was distributed over Colt's struggling body. It was something primal, something they didn't understand. Jace's hand hovered near his gun, but for the first time in his life, he hesitated. Sloane's pulse thundered in her ears as she watched in shock. She had never seen Axel like this. Not once in all the time she had owned him had he ever shown even a fraction of the brutality he was unleashing now. She had always known his history, how he had been deployed in combat zones, how he had saved lives and taken them on command. But knowing was one thing. Seeing it was something else entirely. This wasn't just a loyal dog protecting his owner. This was a soldier executing a mission. Colt let out a raw, agonized scream as he reached blindly with his free hand. His fingers desperately searched for anything that could save him. His palm landed on something rough, solid, a jagged rock. Without thinking, he swung. The rock connected with Axel's skull with a sickening crack. Axel let out a sharp yelp, his body jerking from the impact. For a split second, his grip loosened, but only for a split second. Then, with terrifying determination, he clamped down harder. Colt screamed, his voice turning into a ragged, choking sound of pure agony. Blood dripped from his arm, mixing with the dirt beneath him. The moment of hesitation shattered. Jace's hand snapped to his gun, fingers trembling as he yanked it from his holster. His breath came fast and uneven, panic gripping his chest. His brain screamed at him to do something. Anything, before it was too late. His fingers fumbled over the safety, his heart pounding as he lifted the gun and took aim right at Axel's back. "Don't!" Sloane's voice ripped through the air, but Jace didn't listen. His finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot exploded to the night, a deafening, sharp crack that echoed off the trees, scattering birds in the branches in a frantic flurry of wings. Sloane's breath caught in her throat. Her body froze in pure terror as she watched the scene unfold in slow motion. The muzzle flash from Jace's gun illuminated the horror in front of her, the desperate panic on Colt's bloodied face, the unwavering ferocity in Axel's amber eyes, the faint wisp of smoke trailing from the barrel of the weapon. For a fraction of a second, everything stood still. Then Axel jerked violently, a deep, guttural yelp tearing from his throat. Sloane screamed. The sound ripped from her chest with such force that it barely felt like her own voice. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up, lunging forward with blind instinct as if she could physically stop what had just happened. But it was too late. Axel's powerful frame stumbled backward, his grip on Colt's arm finally releasing. Blood, Colt's blood, dripped from his jaws, but his focus had already shifted. His massive chest rose and fell in heavy, controlled breaths. His eyes, still burning with determination, snapped toward Jace. The bullet had grazed him. The sting of torn flesh registered, but Axel's training was stronger than pain. He had survived worse, fought through worse. A mere gunshot wound would not stop him. Not now, not when his mission was unfinished. Jace's hands trembled around the gun. His heartbeat slammed against his ribcage as he locked eyes with Axel and realized he had just made a fatal mistake. The hesitation in his stance, the uncertainty in his grip. Axel saw it all, and he reacted like a coiled spring being released. Axel launched forward, his powerful hind legs digging into the dirt as he closed the distance in seconds. Jace barely had time to let out a choked sound, something between a curse and a gasp, before Axel hit him full force, knocking the gun from his hands. The weapon clattered to the ground, useless. Jace collapsed onto his back with a grunt, his entire body tensing as 65 pounds of trained fury pinned him down. No. Get it off. Get it off. Jace's screams rang out in sheer terror, his arms flailing as he tried to push Axel away. But it was pointless. Axel wasn't just attacking. He was controlling. Every movement was deliberate. His front paws pressed into Jace's shoulders, locking him in place. His muzzle hovered just inches from Jace's throat, a deep, vibrating growl shaking through his body. Colt, still on the ground, clutched his mangled arm, his teeth gritted in agony as he fought to stay conscious. His vision blurred at the edges. His body screamed at him to surrender to the pain. Ryder, the last man standing, took a slow, shaky step backward, his face drained of color. He had always considered himself tough. He'd fought, he'd bled, had been through some serious things. But this wasn't a fight. This was a war, and they had just lost. Sloane's chest heaved, her pulse still hammering in her ears as she took in the chaos around her. The gun, still lying in the dirt, was just a few feet away. Axel had Jace completely subdued. Colt was barely moving. Ryder looked like he was about to run. This was her moment. She had control. But what she did next would determine how this night would end. Sloane's breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, her body tense as she stood amidst the chaos. Her mind raced, calculating her next move in a way she never had before. Just minutes ago, she had been a victim, a defenseless woman cornered by dangerous men. But now she held the power. The tide had shifted, and for the first time, she saw in their eyes fear. Axel remained on top of Jace, his massive paws digging into the man's shoulders, his muscles locked in perfect restraint. He could have torn out Jace's throat by now, ended it in a single brutal motion. But he didn't, because he was waiting for the command. His ears twitched at every sound, but his eyes never left his pinned target. The growl in his throat rumbled like a warning siren. One wrong move, and it was over. Jace's face was twisted in terror, his chest rising and falling in ragged gasps. Call it off. Call it off, he howled, his voice a sharp contrast to the cocky arrogance he had shown earlier. His fingers twitched at his sides, but he knew better than to move. He had seen what happened to Colt when Axel struck. He knew his next mistake could be his last. Sloane's gaze flickered toward Ryder. He stood a few feet away, his body stiff, every muscle in his frame coiled like a spring, ready to bolt. His eyes darted between Jace, Colt, who was still groaning on the ground, bleeding, and the gun lying in the dirt. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his escape. She followed his gaze. The gun, her pulse quickened. She had never held a weapon in her life. The thought of even touching it made her stomach twist. But this wasn't about what she was comfortable with. This was about survival. If Ryder made it to that gun, if he grabbed it before she did, everything would turn in an instant. Without giving herself time to hesitate, she moved. Her feet hit the ground fast, kicking up dirt as she lunged toward the weapon. Ryder reacted just a second too late, cursing as he dove after it. Their hands reached at the same time, his fingertips grazing the metal, hers closing around the grip. A struggle, a heartbeat of tension. Then Sloane's knee slammed into Ryder's ribs. He choked out a pained grunt, his balance faltering just enough for her to rip the gun from his grasp. She staggered backward, breathless, the cold weight of the weapon settling into her palm. Her hands shook, but she lifted the gun anyway, pointing it directly at Ryder's chest. Silence. Ryder froze, hands half raised, his face drained of color. For the first time all night, Sloane was the one giving orders. The hunted had become the hunter. Sloane held the power now. If you were in her shoes, what would you do next? The weight of the gun in Sloane's hands felt unnatural, its cold metal pressing against her damp palms. Her fingers curled around the grip, her breath hitched in her throat. She had never held a firearm before. She never imagined she would be pointing one at another human being. But here she was, standing in the dirt, blood staining the ground, her pulse thundering in her ears as Ryder stood frozen in front of her, his hands half raised in surrender. Axel remained over Jace, his body taut, his piercing amber eyes flicking between Sloane and Ryder. He was waiting, every muscle in his powerful frame coiled with lethal potential. His growl still reverberated deep in his chest. Sloane knew that if she gave the command, if she even hinted at it, Axel would finish the job. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Ryder licked his lips, his breath ragged. His eyes darted between the gun barrel aimed at his chest and the dog that had just torn into Colt like a trained assassin. His bravado was gone, replaced by something raw, something desperate. Fear, real fear. He took a careful step back, his hands trembling slightly. "Listen," Ryder began, his voice uneven. We don't have to do this. Just let us go. No harm, no foul." Sloane's stomach twisted. No harm, no foul? Was he serious? Colt was on the ground, bleeding. Axel had been shot. They had tried to attack her, to overpower her, to make her another one of their victims. And now, because the table had turned, Ryder wanted to negotiate. Her grip on the gun tightened. "You were going to hurt me." Her own voice sounded strange to her, like it was coming from someone else. "You didn't ask for mercy when you thought you had the upper hand." Ryder's jaw clenched. A flicker of something passed through his eyes. Anger, frustration, shame. It didn't matter. He wasn't in control anymore. From the ground, Colt let out a weak, ragged groan. Jace was silent, pinned beneath Axel, too afraid to move. Ryder was the only one still standing, but not for long. Sloane had the power now. The only question was, what would she do with it? Sloane's finger hovered near the trigger, her pulse hammering in her throat as she stared down the three men who had once thought she was defenseless. The gun felt impossibly heavy in her hands, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. Power, control, the ability to end this night on her terms. Axel remained still, his breathing steady, his body coiled like a predator, waiting for the signal to strike. Ryder was stalling. She could see it in the way his muscles tensed, his shifting stance, the subtle glances he kept throwing toward the darkness beyond the trees. He was searching for an opening, a chance to flee. His fear was real, but Sloane wasn't naive enough to believe it made him harmless. If she lowered the gun now, if she hesitated for even a second, she knew exactly what would happen. He'd run, regroup, and maybe next time she wouldn't be so lucky. Jace let out a sharp breath, his body rigid beneath Axel's crushing weight. The biker's face had lost all color. His hands trembled at his sides. His cocky smirk was gone, replaced by wide, unblinking eyes staring at the massive war dog on his chest. He looked like a man who had just glimpsed death and realized how close it had come. Axel's growl rumbled low and steady, a warning that the threat wasn't over. Colt groaned from where he lay in the dirt, his blood pooling beneath him. His breaths were labored. He was in bad shape. Axel had nearly destroyed his arm, and the blood loss was catching up to him fast. His strength was draining, his fight fading. Even if Ryder tried to escape, even if Jay somehow found a nerve to move, Colt wouldn't be going anywhere. He was done, defeated. Sloane's grip on the gun tightened. Her mind raced, tried to decide what to do. She had them where she wanted them. She could end this permanently, call the police, force him to surrender, or even pull the trigger. They had cornered her like an animal, and now, They were the ones pinned, helpless. Did they deserve mercy? She exhaled slowly, trying to steady her shaking hands. Axel glanced at her, just a flicker of movement. His ears tilting slightly. His muscles shifted. He was waiting. He would act the moment she decided. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Sloane realized this was her decision to make. The silence was suffocating, stretching out between them like an invisible force. The only sounds that remained were the ragged breathing of the men in front of her and the faint rustling of the trees as the wind moved through the branches. Everything else had stopped. No passing cars, no distant voices. Just the weight of the decision pressing down on Sloane's shoulders. The gun in her hands felt heavier now, as if it could sense the conflict raging inside her. She had spent her whole life believing she wasn't capable of violence, but tonight had proven otherwise. Tonight, she had survived. Ryder's fingers twitched at his sides. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths, and his eyes darted once again toward the woods. Sloane caught the movement immediately. He was still looking for a way out. Even after everything, even with the gun trained on him, he wasn't giving up. He was calculating, waiting, like a cornered snake poised to strike the second an opening appeared. And she wasn't about to let him. Axel shifted slightly, his stance lowering as his ears flattened. He sensed it too, the tension, the unspoken warning hanging in the air. His amber eyes never left Ryder, locked onto him with the kind of focus only a trained killer could possess. His breathing was steady, slow, controlled, but the energy radiating off him was unmistakable. He was waiting for her to make the call, waiting for the moment she decided what kind of person she was about to become. Jace let out a shaky breath, his body still pinned beneath Axel's weight. His lips parted, as if he was about to say something, beg, maybe, but no words came. He just stared at Sloane, his pupils wide, his confidence completely shattered. Whatever he thought this night was going to be, it wasn't. This cocky biker who had laughed at her just minutes ago was gone. In his place was a man stripped of all control, paralyzed by fear. Colt, barely conscious, let out a weak groan, but he didn't move. He couldn't. His arm was ruined, blood pooling in the dirt beneath him. The adrenaline that had kept him upright was draining from his body. His fight was over. Even if he wanted to get up, his body wouldn't let him. He wasn't a threat anymore. Not to her. Not to anyone. Sloane's heart slammed against her ribs as she took a step forward, keeping the gun steady. "Don't," she warned, her voice lower than before, more controlled, more dangerous. Ryder froze. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, finally realizing there was nothing left to do. No bluffing, no bargaining, no running. Sloane wasn't backing down. Her hands were still shaking, but her resolve wasn't. And for the first time, Ryder understood they had picked the wrong woman. Sloane's breathing was steady now, but her pulse still pounded in her ears like a drumbeat of adrenaline and fear. The weight of the gun in her hand no longer felt foreign. It was no longer just a hunk of metal. It was power, control, the single thing keeping her from becoming a victim again. She tightened her grip, leveling it at Ryder's chest. He was the last problem standing. Ryder didn't move. He barely breathed, his body stiff as a board, his hands lifted slightly in a pathetic attempt to show surrender. But Sloane didn't buy it. She had seen the way his eyes kept shifting, the way his feet were angled just enough to bolt the second she gave him an opening. He wasn't surrendering. He was waiting, calculating, hunting for the moment she blinked. Axel sensed it too. His ears were tilted forward, his hackles raised, his entire frame humming with tension. He had spent years in combat, trained to read body language, trained to know when a threat was truly gone and when it was just pretending. And right now, Ryder wasn't harmless. Not yet. Jay still lay pinned beneath Axel, his chest rising and falling in sharp, shallow breaths. He had stopped struggling, stopped resisting. The reality of his situation had sunk in. He knew it was over. His confidence, his arrogance, all of it had bled out into the dirt alongside Colt's blood. Sloane barely spared him a glance. Jace wasn't the problem anymore. Colt let out a painful, wet cough from where he lay sprawled in the dirt. His arm was a wreck, mangled beyond recognition from Axel's initial attack. The torn flesh glistened dark under the weak glow of the moonlight. His breathing was ragged, uneven. He was on the verge of unconsciousness. He wouldn't be getting back up. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. That left rider. And Sloane had run out of patience. She took another step forward, her boots grinding against the gravel. Her gaze locked onto him like a predator sizing up its prey. She wasn't scared anymore. She was in control now, and Ryder saw it. She could tell by the way his expression shifted, by the way his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. He knew there was no talking his way out of this. "On the ground," she ordered, her voice low, cold, unyielding. Ryder hesitated. His fingers twitched. A bad sign. Axel let out a warning growl, low and deep, vibrating through his massive chest. A final warning. Ryder swallowed hard, his atoms apple-bobbing in his throat. His teeth clenched, 1,000 unspoken curses flashing behind his narrowed eyes. But he wasn't stupid. He had seen what Axel could do. He had watched Colt fall. He had heard the sickening crunch of Jace hitting the ground. And now, he was staring down the barrel of a gun in the hands of a woman who had nothing left to lose. He had a choice. And for once in his life, Ryder chose correctly. With a sharp exhale, he lowered himself onto his knees. Slowly, carefully, his hands remained raised, his movements deliberate. Sloane tracked every inch of his descent, watching for the slightest twitch, the smallest sign of a trick. There was none. Ryder pressed his palms flat against the dirt, his breath shaky, his entire body radiating defeat. But Sloane didn't lower the gun. Not yet. She wasn't done. Sloane kept the gun raised, her arms locked, her breath steady. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on her, but she didn't let it show. She couldn't. Not yet. Ryder knelt before her, his hands spread flat against the dirt, his muscles still tense, ready to spring the second he saw an opening. He thought he could outlast her, thought she would hesitate, that maybe she didn't have it in her to follow through. But he was wrong. She wasn't the same woman they had cornered an hour ago. Axel remained still, his amber eyes locked onto Ryder's every movement, his breath slow and controlled. The war dog had faced real monsters before, had stood on battlefields where life and death were decided in seconds. This wasn't new to him. His body stayed tense, coiled, waiting for the slightest twitch that signaled another threat. The moment Ryder so much as flinched in the wrong direction, Axel would finish what he started. Jace lay motionless beneath Axel, his chest heaving, his gaze darting between the dog and the gun in Sloane's hands. He had long since stopped resisting. The fight had drained from his eyes, leaving nothing but fear. His lips parted, but no words came. What could he say? That he was sorry? That they didn't mean it? It didn't matter. Colt, still groaning in the dirt, was worse off. His ruined arm pressed against his chest, breathing shallow, his body trembling from blood loss. If he wasn't taken to a hospital soon, he wouldn't make it through the night. Ryder's fingers curled slightly against the ground. Sloane's grip on the gun tightened. "Don't." The word came out sharper than she intended, but she didn't care. She was done letting men like him think they could do whatever they wanted and get away with it. Not this time. She took another step forward, pressing the barrel of the gun to his forehead. His entire body went rigid, his breath catching in his throat. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence, just the wind through the trees, the distant sound of crickets, and the pounding of Sloane's heart. Then finally she spoke. "You're going to leave. All of you. You're going to take Colt, get him to a hospital, and you're never coming near me again. Because if you do," she pressed the gun harder against his skin, "next time I won't hesitate." Ryder nodded, slow and stiff. He believed her. They all did. Sloane stepped back, lowering the gun but never looking away. Axel moved too, finally stepping off Jace. His growl faded, but his stance was still ready for a fight. One by one, the men dragged themselves up, bruised, broken, defeated. They didn't say a word. They just disappeared into the night. Colt half-carried between them. Sloane didn't move until their taillights vanished down the road. Then, and only then, did she exhale, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. Axel nudged her hand, his warmth grounding her, reminding her that she had survived, that it was over. And as she looked down at him, her protector, her soldier, she realized something else. She would never be afraid again. If you enjoyed the story full of action, suspense, and twists, don't forget to leave a like. It helps the channel grow and brings more stories like this. Subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos. And comment below what you would have done in Sloane's place. Your opinion matters. And remember, not all heroes wear capes. Sometimes they have 4 paws and a war-torn past. See you in the next story.